Hello. Welcome to the Historical Arguments and Practice lecture on time. My name is Rohit Dattaroy. So, before we get into the text we'll be sort of unpacking throughout this course, let's talk briefly about what is time and why is its relevance so important to map throughout the emergence and of the historical discipline and also the evolution of history writing, both within and beyond academia. So, time as a concept is something we've all tried to grapple with, especially the early human civilizations. Sometimes the narrators of the early histories thought themselves as objects of time, as stationary objects. Sometimes they thought themselves as active agents of time. Then, at other times, there were attempts to mark the passage of time, so to speak. And it was much later, with the emergence of Western Christendom, that there was an understanding that time is sort of this thread on which human events need to be imploded. If you think of it in reality, we'll come back to this later during the course, that events which happen in our lifetime, if you remove the idea of linear time, they really happen in a very chaotic manner, right? Only when you're imploding them into this linear narrative of an idea of a beginning, a middle, and an end, then you start thinking that, okay, maybe there was this linear movement and all of these events happen one after the other, and you start sort of thinking of causality. But the moment you start removing that chain of events, that linear notion of time, you see that events in the universe and with us as human beings, as individuals, really happen at random, right? So what this then does, in a sense, is throws a challenge to history writing, which it wouldn't be out of place to say it's very akin to the challenge that was thrown by the the Newtonian challenge to the idea of the location of Earth in the solar system, and also similar to Darwinian challenge to human evolution. So what this then does is, if you think that events are happening with you at random, there is no larger deterministic vision. There is no thrust. There is no divine journey intended in what is happening with us in particular and human civilization in general. What it then does is it makes us open to the idea that human the journey of human civilization, the journey of humankind, is essentially in disarray. So our attempt in writing history, in trying to narrativize our past, in trying to sort of stitch together these events in one fine detail, is essentially an attempt of trying to make sense amidst that chaos, right? So once we have this idea of why time is so very essential for our writing, because if we remove the notion of time for all these great narrativists, you find that the idea of history as this slow progression of humankind is challenged, right? And this is how we will try to make sense of the various ways in which time has been conceptualized, in which time has been understood, and how time has aided the evolution of history writing, and from there, the evolution of history as an academic or professional discipline. So, let us begin by one of the texts assigned to you, that is Hartog. So when Hartog talks about these regimes of historicity, what do you understand of it? What do you make of it, right? So let's understand. He gives a brief explanation there, but let's think of this. The three terms that he uses, right? Chronos, crisis, and kairos. So if chronos is the overarching measure of time, right? The passage of human epochs, if you will, then kairos is essentially the point of departure from a crisis, right? From an event that you are now or that you would like to comprehend, right? Make sense of. So that's there. So what we mean by regimes of historicity is essentially very similar to, let's say, what you could mean when you actually talk about regimes of paper. So historicist cultures, when they first emerges, around the time of the Renaissance, the post-Renaissance period, what they're essentially doing is trying to go back to the cultures from which there has been a rupture. So trying to make sense of cultures in continuum, traditions in continuum, and move beyond that rupture. And here enters a concept that we'll constantly be dealing with in our apprehensions of this notion of time, and that is presentism. So why is Hartog convinced that it is the zeal to sort of, within that chronos to reach kairos, is essentially the problem? It is because we're guided by presentism, right? It is because we're guided by this presentist, the requirement of our present, of our current time, or our current moment, to go back in time and draw lessons from it that will perhaps resolve the crises of our futures. Do you see a basic anomaly here from how humans in the past, or again, to not use the word past, but humans in prehistoricist cultures would have actually taken to histories, or taken to narratives, remembering their past? So, in a sense, humans in earlier times, in sort of pre-medieval times, call it ancient, call it early medieval, call it what you will, for them, the emergence of, chronological setting down of narratives, the emergence of something like Odysseus' journey in Homer, or emergence of, Thucydides, or emergence of or Herodotus, was more about leaving these narratives, these embodied traditions, as part of a living reality through the ages, right? So for them, this was not as much about edification. This wasn't as much about lessons for future lives, right? So it served a different purpose, but it was the specific crises of the post-Renaissance, post breakdown, this rupture of tradition that you find in Hartog, where it was that presentist inquiry which sort of gave a privileged position to time. That, of course, now becomes that we now begin to question with something that Hartog refers to, and it was also a part of your secondary material, that is Rovelli. What Rovelli talks about, and how time essentially fractures, and it's fundamentally being restructured in front of our own eyes as we live through the present scientific research that borders or sort of hinges on Einstein's theory of relativity. So think of it this way. Let's think of it this way. When Hartog actually talks about, I'd like to take you back to the Christian regime of historicity that he talks about. What does he say there, right? He says that what is this texture of new time that we find in these Christian texts, right? And I'll link this with the other texts that you have studied. So what is this regime, this texture of new time, right? So it is quite different, he says, from contemporary presentism, the contemporary presentism that you would find in historical texts from the here and the now, from Hartog's time and broadly from the 19th century onwards. But how is this different? He says that there is a sense of fullness of time, right? The past is important, but it is so largely because it anticipates and prefigures the present, right? So it's not as much that, so we do not go from the past towards the present, right? Which is the fundamental nature of present day positivist, objectivist texts, that they try to give you the sense that there is this movement of linear time. From the past, we are moving to this present, to the time that when the historian, as this objective sort of narrator, stops his narrative. So never are you really a witness, right? He says that you, in this fullness of time, there is the prefiguring of the present, yes, because we do not go from the past towards the present, but from the present towards the past. It's in a sense there is overlap, and we must learn to live in the inevitable gap between this space of experience and this horizon of expectation. So if you again try to make sense of this. In the present, the rupture that we are trying to deal with is a rupture not created by us. This could be what Hartog talks about, the world that the translations opened up. So in essence, you're trying to capture a bygone era through your histories, right? Trying to make sense of a past which is no more accessible, right? So this rupture, you constantly feel that it's not a rupture created by you. So you're trying to make sense of it. You're trying to, there's a requirement to sort of grab on or sort of hold to that past. And hence, there's this journey that is being projected. Think of how in the Textures of Time text by Subramaniam, Shulman, and Rao, there's the same argument, right? That what they say when they say that, it's this Kala Jnana. They talk about this Kala Jnana. So why has this Kala Jnana infiltrated the frame of this historical account, the text that they look at, right? Because events long past are now remembered or couched in proleptic language, as if the past contained within itself available forms of knowledge about its future unfolding, right? Think of it in the same context, like in the fullness of the time argument that you find in Hartog and others, right? So there is a greater understanding of the future unfolding within the narratives itself. Okay, so the rupture in these contexts is a rupture of humankind's own making. So the rupture in Hartog's Christian historicist cultures is more deliberate, but the rupture that a present day historian deals with is defined by a rupture, a time, a past time, which is difficult to access. Hence, the rupture is not one of his own making. So he constantly has to grapple with these large, abrupt, and huge, vast planes, spatial temporal spaces, which are not bridged for him anymore, right? Hence there is the journey from presentist time back to the past, and also the need to project this linear movement, this linear chronology. So what is important is that, again, going back to what Shulman, Rao, and Subramaniam talk about, is that this scheme that we find in many pre-modern texts, before these texts have been sort of imbued with the historicist cultures of advent of the 19th century historicist traditions, is that temporality, a notion of temporality that we find in these texts, is somewhat different from the sequential linear narrative that have come to embody, and this is very important, have not just come to embody historical genres of writing, but also things like historical fiction, right? I mean, initially, and this is what my own research is about, initially in the 19th century, you find historical fiction was still situated at a place where it was sort of blurring the lines between that sequential linear notion of time and that, notion of temporality in pre-modern text, where it was more conscious of its own future implications. Its time was existing through ruptures as well as continuum, overlaps. So, but even as the 19th century sort of draws to a close, an academic history becomes an academic vocation, a professional calling, if you will. It's at that point when this sequential linear narrative of time takes center stage in both historical fiction as well as academic histories. Which is very interesting, is that if you look at it from now, from where we are in the current state of affairs, you will find that what Rovelli talks about, that with each passing day, time is not a certainty anymore. So this raises an important question. Are we then all going to think like the postmoderns? How does then this affect our notion of truth? How does this affect our notion of an absolute past? So this is what I'm going to discuss now, and through the text of both Textures of Time and Thapar. But before we actually talk about Thapar and sort of link that with Textures of Time, let's dwell a bit more on Hartog, and through Hartog on Koselleck and Ricker, because I haven't referred you specifically to Koselleck in your secondary reading, so I won't go much into Koselleck, but suffice to say that for Koselleck, the conceptual notions of this temporality, this linear temporality, and this attempt at finding a synchronicity for the non-synchronous is essentially born out of 18th century Enlightenment, if you will. Now, there are disagreements I have with that, because while 18th century Enlightenment are the ideas which underline research in the 19th century, but it's really in the 19th century that history writing as a genre and historical research as a profession starts to sort of take off. And that's where I think Ricker is far more closer to the understanding that history sort of as a way of thinking, as the regimes of historicity of Hartog, essentially begins with historical genre of writing, right? Because it is through narratives, as Ricker sees it, that there is an emplotment of time. The time is, structured in a way through these historical narratives, if you will, right? Prior to that, the historical genre was enmeshed in multiplicity of genres. There was no singling out something as a historical genre. I mean, even Thucydides, let's say Herodotus, right? I mean, Herodotus, where would you say that this is history and this is not, a fiction and this is not hearsay? I mean, Herodotus during his time faced criticisms of including hearsay, anecdotes, and so many other things. So the shape that history as a genre starts taking, in the 19th century, to Ricker, essentially it's the narratives of history writing which implot a sense of linear time. And this is very important, because if you think of it in a sense, this takes us back to the watchmaker analogy, right? I mean, think of Voltaire after Candide, the earthquake, and so on. Think of the deists, and how the idea that there is a teleological argument, from Newton to Descartes, and from deism, from early deism, the fact that there is an absentee watchmaker. So why would the maker of this universe was suddenly being considered as an absentee, as initially as a watchmaker in 1802 in William Paley's book? You have to ask yourself, why was it specifically a watchmaker and nothing else? Because again, this goes back to both Koselleck, in a sense, this is a post-Enlightenment rationale, but also more importantly in how the regimes of historicity and historicist cultures had now started to take shape, and essentially human civilization was being thought of in these linear terms, like something which was constantly under the shadow of the chronos, right? The kairos of spontaneous time, of events, was essentially guided and worked under the shroud of the chronos, and the attempt of crises was to sort of move beyond, establish that link beyond that rupture. And this essentially was not swayed by, let's say, even the Darwinian revolution. In fact, they say that the Darwinian revolution, if anything, sort of established the principle of uniformitism, right? That every process was not just a non-synchronous way of looking at the universe, but in essential, in a sense, it was working in synchronic time. It was working through this larger linear chain, if you will, and this fundamentally set up the nature of temporality in Western Christendom. I mean, Hartog actually pushes it far back in the translations. I mean, you can, in fact, this yearning to push it as far back as possible, to the Roman Empire, the Anglo-Saxons looking for a beginning, the search for an origin, sui generis. This actually takes you back further and further in when this idea of temporality is embedded in Ricker's idea of narratives, emplotting events in a sort of chronological mold, in a linear mold. But if you think of it in the non-Western context, especially, let's say, in texts of Subramaniam, Shulman, and Rao, you see that the birth of a synchronic teleological understanding of time as this overarching plenary, if you will, is fundamentally coming with the advent of historical writing as a separate genre, and that is happening with the epistemic invasion of colonial epistemology and the rupture that it brings about, right? And they see that pre-modern texts, in a sense, it's not like they do not embody a sense of time, do not embody a sense of the past, but as we discussed a few moments earlier, what they're trying to do is they're in a sense encompassing the future, right? They can see the future unfolding as they speak. So it is in a sense a narrative where the past, the current, and the future sort of coalesce, right? And it is only with the coming in of the modern so-called 19th century historian, who is plagued by presentist ideas all the more, that there is this imperative to show that time is moving from this position in the past to the present, right? And there is this narrator who is the objectivist viewer of events, not a witness, remember, never a witness. The narrator as a witness is again a classic sort of pre-modern contraption, where it comes very naturally for the narrator to not to separate them from the time or the chronos in which the events are unfolding, because they are party to it. But again, it becomes imperative for the modern historian to think of themselves as separate from the chronos in which things are unfolding. Come to think of it, how many works of contemporary historical research do you see happening in our universities? That is also one very important reason, because the foundational idea of modern historical scholarship has been that you need this distance, from your sources. Of course, one reason is always that sources are not declassified as, as soon as an event of a large nature transpires. But the more important reason why you see so many a lack of contemporary histories in our universities, research on contemporary histories, is primarily because of this really modern notion that an amount of time needs to have passed before you can actually begin to conceptualize that passing of time, that time which is now not in the present anymore, that bygone era, that bygone epoch, that time which is gone now, the time which was past. So this sense of trying to make, this historian essentially as somebody who is, trying to work within this regime of historicity and not engaging with the historian's own methods, which is what Ricker talks about, that the narratives and plot time is one of the fallacies that we'll now come to in talking about Thapar and Shulman, Subramaniam and Rao. When Thapar talks about the ideas of time in Indian traditions having been coming to be seen as circular instead of being linear, it was, of course, an epistemic invasion in the post-Mill period, when it was seen that, why was India so given to colonization. One of the reasons was that it was an unchanging universe, right? It was an unchanging civilization, which is why it was easy, a sort of cogent argument to make that in India, time was represented in a circular fashion, where no matter how much ahead you went, you sort of came back to where you had begun. The Christendom, in that sense, it represented a linear movement of time. So there was progression, and that's what they were bringing to the subjugated races. But what is interesting is that this notion of time in a circular manner was not actually unknown to Christian world, or not unknown to the pagans from which Christians were translating their texts and learning about the universe, and to whose world the Christians wanted to bridge sort of an undulated beginning to. They were seeking a beginning for themselves that went back in time. And this was certainly happening around the romantic traditions when they were emerging, like, people like Keats writing about the Grecian urn and so on. So even in the world of literature, there was a sort of a requirement for the origins. But when it came to the colonized spaces, there was an argument that here they represented a sense of circular time, right? But what is interesting is that this notion of circular time. I mean, Romila makes a critic that this was essentially to show an unchanging nature of the universe, right? A time which was also destructive. So Kala and Kal, so destruction, a sense of destruction as well. But and it's sort of an encapsulation of the mythopoeic time, mythologizing the past. What is important is that, and this is where there's an interesting writing by Rabindranath Tagore, which is, of course, not part of your secondary material because he's not specifically talking about time, but it was one of the early histories that he had written about India. And there he talks about how India and its past and its civilization essentially represents a constant renewal. So the Bengali word he uses is nitto nutanu, right? And this is very interesting. If you think of it in this term, you suddenly realize that it makes sense based on what Rovelli and others have talked about the notions of time current to the physics research that's happening all around us. So, what if the beginning of the universe, the Big Bang, if you will, was essentially the beginning of a universe with the death of the previous universe? So, like, what if the birth of the universe is, in a sense, a renewal of the universe from a point of origin, which is essentially a point of previous death, a point of end, so to speak, of the previous chronos and the birth of a new chronos, right? Through through a kairos, a sudden rupture, a sudden. So, in a sense, what Rabindranath talks about in Nitya Nutano was essentially a counter, a decolonial counter to the Western notions of time that he encountered in his time, in his in his writings, was that he felt that in Indian civilization there was, of course, a linear notion of time, of progress, of because it had to be, right. There was a tracking of lineages, there was a tracking of kings, chronicles, and all of that. So there was definitely a linear motion of time, but there was also a sense of renewal, right? That not everything about the past was lost. A lot of it was carried forward, renewed, in newer forms, in newer fashions, and time went on in this way. So if you think of it from a circle, but the debates between a circular fashion, and a linear time, it becomes a spiral of sorts, right? So what happens when you take apart a string which is put into a circle? If you can take it apart, you can then make it into a spiral, right? So essentially what Rabindranath is talking about is a spiral which can then open up and then move forward. It gets the ability to move forward, but it has not forgotten that it comes from this circular movement, right? This is very similar, let's say, to those of you who are aware and have seen it, to the Ashoka symbol, the Dharma Chakra Pravartana, the cycle of Dharma, the cycle of life and laws, which is also part of the Indian Republic's official symbol. And that essence, that Ashoka's laws is represented as a wheel, a chakra, is very important because a chakra is circular, but it also moves forward. And this is where the notion of time, because Ashoka wanted to encapsulate his sense of laws, his sense of dharma for his universe, for his polity, in a timeless manner, so to speak. Hence, the idea of the chakra pravartana is very important. It also links itself with the Buddhist notions of time, where the idea that there is that one goes on in life through all these phases, ultimately waiting for nibbana or nirvana, essentially is replicated through that chakra pravartana, right? That the phases, keep going on and on. So, which is very important to remember. And this also links us back to, say, what Lynn Hunt talks about when she says that one thing which is often forgotten is Pierre Nora's classic work on memory, on how memory, and why historians sort of hate memory, is because memory is given to these large jumps between the present, the past, and the future, right? So when Lynn Hunt talks about how in Nora's work, history is all about this, this nostalgia for the past, but in the sense history is also structured, but it's in through memory that there is this slippage, of the present into a historical past, right? And this is also very similar to what Ricker was engaging with, that why was, what Hartog talks about presentism, right? That the presentism which plagues historical time, well, and then in his recent work, he says that one reason for it is because history sort of had to presuppose this journey from a point of origin to the present, while in previous works, the future, there was a consciousness of the future being embodied in that, the present, future, and the past being embodied in the same narrative. So this becomes very important in understanding this passage of time, if you will, or what is time, or as we were discussing, why this image of the watchmaker and not any other image, right? This, in a nutshell, this makes us understand how the modern narratives, whether it is through Koselleck's post-Enlightenment historicist cultures or the historicist cultures of the 19th century that Hartog has talked about in Regimes of Historicity, why there is this burgeoning notion of time as this prime mover of objects, sort of this standard, this bearer, a benchmark, a measure alongside which human events can then be plotted, then be tracked. And this becomes fundamental to how the sciences were being seen in relation to the humanities and the social sciences as well. I told you about the universal notions and how Darwinian research was also being linked to fitting into this world of the universal synchronicity of synthesis and so on. But now we are dealing with this new point of questioning that we find in Rovelli's work. And we'll come to that through our inquiry, by continuing our inquiry in the works of Thapar, in the works of Shulman, Rao, Shulman, and Subramaniam in Textures of Time. So before we come to Rovelli, let's understand textures of time, right? This is a very fascinating concept. So why, and they give an explanation to it, why have the three authors named their text the textures of time, right? What do you mean by textures? Taken very lightly, it means that, time to different cultures could be a sense, a feeling of different textures, right? Of different, let's say, could be the formation of ridges. There could be the formation of mild ruptures. Could be the formation of disruptions in their temporal notions, their spatiotemporal notions, right? So when cultures are trying to replicate their sense of the past, they're thinking through events, right? Essentially, these events may not or need not be synchronous, right? They need not have a plan, a grand plan, a grand narrative to them. But these events occur, and because these events occur, they somehow help these cultures frame their notion of the past. And it is important that we understand textures and the framing of textures through this. Therefore, it is important to understand that in the context of textures, a text which will not be exclusively written in the historical genre may still contain facticity in it, right? May still contain embodied historical truth, embedded historical consciousness. And this is what Shulman, Rao, and Subramaniam are trying to get at when they say that in the past 200 years, during colonial rule, there was a widespread epistemic violence, if you will, on the indigenous traditions and the cultures of historical writing that preceded the coming in of the advent of the colonizers. And this is very important because think of it in two. I'll give you two different examples of this. One is, let's say, people like Trevelyan. Trevelyan was writing in England that what is this social science, history as science that's being done in Germany? It's like an attack on history which should be written in the sort of, it's a humanistic model. It's not a science. And in a sense, the history that was written in England was also criticized by places where Rankian models had taken center stage, and empirical evidences became important. History was not for moral edification anymore. But again, when this comes to the relationship between the colonizer and the colonized, which is the context of England and India, there is that epistemic violence that Subramaniam talks about. And all of this is being essentially played out through the understanding of time, right? So in Germany, through the Junker or the Prussian monarchy, there's an advent of a new rupture, a rupture which the historians are fathoming, they're sort of welcoming. In England, there is an understanding that this rupture is not good because then the Anglo-Saxon history cannot be pushed back. So there is a yearning to connect it with long forgotten traditions. So time itself, the understanding of time, the way time is conceptualized, takes on different meanings in different contexts, right? So in the context of India, let's talk about the text Bobili Petaraju. There is this idea embedded facticity, right, from vast numerical data that it is embedded with. So this is true of most pre-modern Indian historical texts, which may have not been written in a narrative long form mold, right? Histories could have been embedded in poetics, in poetry, in a rhyming scheme, and so on. Bardic lore could have come to encapsulate history. This is very true of, let's say, embodied histories around even monuments. So, for example, there's this monument which is known as the site of the Battle of Bhima Koregaon. In modern day India, this was the battle site for Bhima Koregaon, which was fought on 1st January 1818. It was a battle where the Dalit soldiers fought in the British Army against the Peshwa. This is very similar to what Pierre Nora has argued as a rapid slippage of the present in the historical past, because today this site has become a site of pilgrimage for Dalits who see this as a site of freedom from Brahmanic tyranny per se. And on the other hand, large sections of Indian society do not see this as a site of pilgrimage, and in many ways have today again memorialized through collective amnesia and collective memorialization the Peshwa rule as one rule of resistance against the colonizers. So time again is embodied in narratives in a different manner by different communities. And this is why the understanding of textures, the understanding of cultural, how different regimes of historicity function. And it's very important that it's a regimes of historicity, not regime, because different regimes of historicity give birth to different registers of thinking through the chronos, the kairos, and the crisis, and different registers of thinking about time and conceptualizing time. And this becomes very important as we try to grapple with writing history in a post-Einstein sort of time as relative universe. Why do I say this? So this is very important. So, for example, all of you are probably familiar with the clock experience, right? So a clock recording time on the top of Mount Everest would not be recording time in the same manner as a clock here in Cambridge, right? So in a sense, the clock, at the top of Mount Everest would have slowed down. So this is how we reach this conclusion that time is relative, and clocks are in a sense measuring each other. They're not measuring time. Clocks are one attempt at making sense of time, right? As all of you are aware, we have less than 24 hours in a day, but for the convenience of it all, we have narrowed it down to 24 hours. Similarly, not every day is 24 hours, but we have again narrowed it down to this. Not every year is 365 days. We've narrowed it down. So what I'm trying to say is time as a measure is his attempt to give a synchronous, linear founding to sort of chaotic human events, which, if left to their own devices, would be conceptualized rather abruptly through slippages, through arbitrary travels back and forth by human conceptualization. To avoid that and to give a sense that human history, the history of humankind, is one of constant evolution, universalization, if you will. there is this notion that time is in itself something which is passing, and we are recording our events by using time as a measure. In the final segment, I would urge you to think of history as discussion, as a never ending series of discussions, right? So, if you have the Rankians on one side, you also have the critique of this grand plan in history, right? Or grand plan in human action, or the science of history, a critique coming from that, critique to that coming from people like Croce, right? People like, let's say, when Frank Kermode, that I think I shared the book of David Carr with you, when David Carr talks about what Frank Kermode says, that when we think of clocks, the mechanical hands moving, we think of immediately the idea that comes to mind for somebody familiar with and an anglicized universe, it would be tick tock, right? But if you come to think of it, it is the sounds that we have assigned to this clock, in a sense, right? Do the hands actually make a sound tick tock? It doesn't. But if you try to convince yourself that it makes a sound talk tick, you will see that it won't work that way, right? You won't be able to think of it in that sound. And this is also very similar to Louis Mink and Hayden White's argument of how history is an unending series of narrative emplotments. This could also be linked to, I'm sure all of you are familiar with E.H. Carr, of what E.H. Carr says of the historian, in a sense, playing a role of a narrativist, ordering facts, and only that essentially giving out the meaning of facts. So, because as historians we're constantly, reordering and ordering facts, presenting a narrative, time is of the utmost essence for us, right? If we begin thinking that time is relative, then everything falls down. Because, like I said, that chronos, that plane, temporal plane, which is sort of like the time's arrow that Linhan talks about, gives a sense of direction, a sense of motion, a sense of purpose. The moment you remove that, then there would be an absolute chaos, right? These events could be happening at absolute random. It is this attempt to search for a pattern in this randomness, search for an order in chaos. That was what was the sort of guiding principle of history writing in the 19th century, right? And of course, going back to Koselleck's idea that it was the Enlightenment rationale of the 18th century which influenced the historicist cultures, the regimes of historicity in the 19th century of Hartog, and so on. I would urge you to now think of history through the latest research and time that's happening on the in the discipline of physics, as identified by Rovelli and others, and also to think of time. If time becomes relative, as we now know, then and clocks are essentially a measure of each other, then what is more important is how or what are the causes, or what are the effects this has on the universalizing potential of grand narratives, of meta histories, of world histories, right? Of the global. We live through an age where the global is sort of strewn all over any sort of history that's written, because it's as if the philosophizing potential of history, as Croce would talk to you about, that philosophizing potential of history is nothing without it being sort of participant in this global moment of our history, right? So I would urge you to think through these ideas, to perhaps question what is the importance of these notions. And before ending, I would again go back to something which is linked to this notion of history and historicity and time, which is, of course, the notion of periodization. And I would end with this, with a few comments on periodization per se. So periodization is very important because in a modern time scale, we now follow largely the Gregorian calendar. But it is important that before the standardization in the 6th century in the Western world, and of course the standardization in the Eastern world, the mythopoeic time spanned across centuries, thousands of years, right? In India, you have the Dwapar Yuga, the Treta Yuga, the Satya Yuga, and in Christendom, you have 5,000, 6,000 years spanning the lifetime of human civilizations, sometimes changes and all of these. So why is this change in periodization also important and intrinsically linked with how time came to be seen as the very wheels of history? The Dharma Chakra Pravartan becomes time in this case, right? Except the Dharma Chakra Pravartan was a wheel. Here, the time becomes the tracks, like the railway tracks or a road, a flat surface. So there's lesser duality to it. There's lesser dialectics to it, if you will. So, in this context, periodization is something we'll have to think about. And I'd like to reflect on the text of Ramila Thapa, the text of the textures of time text, and of course David Carr on periodization. So, as we draw a close to this lecture, it's important that the concept of periodization and its linkage with time becomes evident. So, Romila Thapar argues, as we would find in the text, that the problems that time, conceptualizing time in a linear framework has for periodization is that you then choose one or the other factor as one of the main catalysts for social change. In Western Christendom, it was essentially religious factors, right? So either it could be religious reform or the birth of the ecclesiastical traditions, ecclesiastical changes. What this does to largely heterodox and pluralist society like India, then it insinuated with the epistemological epistemic invasion that Shulman, Rao, and Subramanya talks about, it insinuates that these large-scale changes happen in Indian context through invasions, through religious shifts, and therefore periods are assigned accordingly. Now, this creates a dangerous precedence for modern history in India, as it latches historical change to specific identities, the birth of specific religious identities, leading to the fractured and violent nature of society in India. This problem essentially is also the way time being conceptualized in a linear framework has created, the problems time being conceptualized in a linear framework has created wherever historicists, these regimes of historicity, these historicist cultures have had lasting influence and led essentially to the birth of a specific kind of modernity, the prevalence of a specific kind of historicist modernity in societies. And I would like you to think through these ideas in making sense of the effect of conceptualizing time in a particular manner, the regimes of historicity, the importance of Enlightenment traditions of synchronic time, universal notions of time, but then the challenges from the traditional, the spiral notions of time, if you will, how these challenges were thwarted, but the current challenges through researchers in the scientific disciplines of time being relative, and how the idea of birth and regeneration could, in a sense, be proven correct, the idea of renewal, right? And once you try to relate to these ideas in the context of the text that we have chosen, I'm sure you'll be able to understand the perennial problem or debates and discussions that the notion of time gives rise to when it comes to using it as a critical theme in our historical method. Thank you.